kind of connected the human to the sort of animal world and further paved the way for the evolutionary theory. And he had these different theories of meteorology and mineralogy. He was just a universal genius. A lot of people sort of regarded him as a dilettante in this respect, but Steiner thought otherwise. So Steiner starts out, and he's only 21, 22 years old, and he's editing these works, and he publishes his first book at the age of 25. Probably that would be Uranus, Trine Uranus. So many of these German geniuses publish right around 25, 26, their first books usually, right on that Uranus Trine. And that was a little text on Goethe's conception of the world, and then he publishes, his writings and lecturing, and he's living in Vienna. And then right about 1890, he's done with that project. It sort of dries up, and he moves over to Weimar, where he picks up the editorship of a magazine, which was a general literary periodical that had nothing to do really with any of his interests, but he picked up this experience as an editor. And meanwhile, though, he's living in this world, and dealing with Germany at this time was the place to be if you had any intellectual interest whatsoever, because scholarship was really invented by the Germans in the 19th century. From Goethe's dates are 1749 to 1832, and it's in Goethe's day, Goethe and Schiller, and then they're followed by Kant and Schopenhauer and Hegel. All these great German philosophers, they sort of reinvent philosophy, that whole group. There's philosophy before them and philosophy after them, and the Germans just sort of reinvented it. And part of the way in which they did it had to do, although this comes after Kant, with Schopenhauer's discovery of the Upanishads, and the Germans were the ones who discovered the wisdom of the Orient. They sort of brought it over, took it seriously, started translating the texts, and although the first texts were French translations. But Schopenhauer was so enraptured with the Upanishads that he did exactly what Plotinus' teacher Ammonius Saccas had done, a synthesis of sort of Plato, Aristotle, and the Hindus. And what you get there is the world as will and representation. And Nietzsche picks it up from Schopenhauer. Schopenhauer is Nietzsche's idol, and in addition to Wagner, and he meets Wagner, and Wagner has, Wagner's operas. Again, you can't understand really Wagner's operas without understanding Schopenhauer, the way in which you can't really understand Renaissance painting without understanding Plotinus. It's a translation into art of a specific high conceptual system. And Nietzsche was absolutely enraptured by Wagner, so he writes The Birth of Tragedy, and that comes out in 1872, which is this wonderful paean to the greatness of German culture and how Wagner's reinvented opera and given it a whole new life cycle. Several years pass then, and Nietzsche reconsiders Wagner, and then he begins to think of Wagner as representing actually the end of German culture and the end of classical music. And he says, the Germans take themselves too seriously, and everything that's wrong with German culture, everything that the rest of the world sort of caricatures us as being introverted, broody, taking ourselves too seriously, all of that is what's wrong with Wagner. Contrast Carmen, Bizet's Carmen, or Mozart's operas with Wagner, and you'll see what I'm talking about. There's no laughter in here anywhere. And so Nietzsche lost his friendship with Wagner after Wagner wrote Parsifal, which is his attempt to sort of reinvent Christianity, and it's just really, it's absolutely sanctimonious. And Nietzsche couldn't stand it. And then he wrote Human All Too Human, and Wagner read that, and that was the end of their relationship. And then sort of Nietzsche got going, and then the stream moves on. Nietzsche then went insane at about the age of 44, oddly enough, after his sort of Uranus opposite Uranus there. It'd be interesting to look at the transits to his birth chart. But he had this wonderful period of creativity. Then he went insane about the age of 44. And Steiner then went to visit him after Goethe. He was sort of done with the Goethe phase, and then he becomes fascinated, this is in the 1890s, with Nietzsche, primarily because of Nietzsche's philosophy of freedom. Nietzsche was, of course, a nihilist, and the nihilistic aspect of Nietzsche did not interest Steiner in the least. But what did interest him was Nietzsche's preoccupation with human freedom. Nietzsche was very emphatic that, with the death of God and the death of all of these great systems, we should take advantage of this new freedom and opportunity to reinvent ourselves as humans. And man is an inherently creative being and can establish whatever value system he wants for himself. He doesn't have to rely on gods and angels and so forth. All of that has been discredited. So there's this, the whole Superman philosophy comes out of this rich creativity that he sort of stands up for and shouts about. And Steiner was fascinated about that because one of Steiner's absolute main focal points is an emphasis that our will is free. And freedom is something that has gradually developed through the evolution of human consciousness. It's not something we should take for granted. It's something that has been granted to us, in a sense, in seed form by these angelic hierarchies, but it's something that we've had to sort of earn for ourselves through the evolution of human culture. And so it was very important to him. His first sort of significant book is called The Philosophy of Freedom, and it has nothing to do with these later anthroposophical ideas, but it has to do with that subject of freedom. And this came out, I think, in 1894, and he published that, and then he sort of goes to visit Nietzsche. And he had befriended, I guess, Nietzsche's sister, and Nietzsche's sister was thinking, well, he'll do for, Nietzsche, all of Nietzsche's unpublished writings, what he'd been doing for Goethe's work. So she wants to sort of take advantage of him in that sense. But he goes in to see Nietzsche, and Nietzsche, of course, is catatonic, and he's sitting there, and he, later on at the end of his life, he tells the story of his visit of Nietzsche in karmic relationships, and he says, I went in and I looked at him, and he looked very peaceful. He was sitting there with his beard, and he was just sort of gazing off into space as though he had just had his morning breakfast and was contemplating his next book. And he had a very peaceful look about him. But he said, I began to sort of see clairvoyantly into the fact that I could see Nietzsche's astral body sort of hovering above him there, sort of thinly connected, very thinly, still connected, but only faintly to the physical body. And then later on, I reflected on it, and I thought about Nietzsche, and I thought about this sense of bodilessness in Nietzsche. There's a sense where, Nietzsche constantly had these migraine headaches, and he had somatic problems. He was always sick with one thing and another. And then he would do things like he would write while taking his morning walk. He would actually write while walking. He just had this strange sense of not being in his body. And Steiner said, when I did the reincarnation research on Nietzsche, when I sort of saw into the spiritual world of Nietzsche, I realized that Nietzsche was actually this reincarnated monk, a Franciscan monk, back in the 12th or 13th century who had been obsessed with flagellating himself. And that's a little sort of anecdote that he tells about Nietzsche. So that's the kind of thing that we're in for here as we move into Steiner, those anecdotes that will make most academics uncomfortable and will end the conversation immediately. So Steiner's developing along, and he decides he doesn't want to do any more work about Nietzsche's work. The nihilism probably just turned him off, and the sort of spiritual vacuousness and emptiness in Nietzsche. And then, so time goes by, and then he sort of bumps into these theosophists. And now, Theosophy had just gotten off the ground in 1875. Madame Blavatsky was this Russian woman who had started it. I actually don't know a lot about it. All I know is that it is very heavily oriented toward the East. It's sort of presented as a syncretistic kind of synthesis of all the great world religions. And if you look at their symbol and iconography, they draw, from the Egyptian Ankh and the Star of David and all this. But they're really heavily leaning toward India. And this was a thing that always bothered Steiner, despite the fact that Steiner did draw from India, as all the great German thinkers were doing in one way or another at this time. But he, in particular, he actually uses lots of Sanskrit terminology, as we'll see. And even in spite of that, Steiner remained a Christian to the very end, although not an Orthodox Christian. As we'll see, he invented his own myth of Christianity, and it's nothing that any good Christian would ever recognize as properly Christian. But he was very emphatic on this one central point. Christ was a being who had incarnated, was an avatar who had come down from the sun and incarnated once and once only, and could never have incarnated again, primarily because Christ is now the spirit of the earth and has sort of transubstantiated the earth into this spiritual vessel. But the problem with that is the Theosophists, Charles Leadbeater had, on the beaches in India, had discovered Jiddu Krishnamurti and his brother Nityananda playing these young boys on the beach, beautiful young boys, absolutely radiant when you look at these early black and white photographs of these children. And